I never thought 17 years of my life, a career built in the silent depths of the ocean and the classified halls of the Pentagon, could be erased by a single sentence, uttered by a boy young enough to be my son. But that's exactly what happened today. It all started with a decision made in a glass conference room, a fishbowl of an office where every success and every failure was put on public display. I am Elias Vance, 54 years old, and for the last 17 years I was the lead architect of the most sophisticated encryption systems at Aegis Dynamics. Outside that fishbowl, my entire team of world-class engineers was frozen in place. Keyboards were silent. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of shock and concern, were locked on the scene unfolding before them. Inside, it was just me and him, Preston Hayes III. The 29-year-old heir to the company stood before me, a smug smile playing on his lips that never quite reached his eyes. He leaned casually against the polished mahogany table, the picture of inherited confidence. So as I was saying, he began, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. We're pivoting towards a new paradigm of agility and innovation. It requires a forward-thinking mindset, a team of true disruptors. He paused for dramatic effect, looking me up and down as if I were an old piece of furniture he was about to replace. And unfortunately, that means we have to let go of some of our more traditional assets. He said the words with a practiced sincerity, the kind you learn in a business school seminar on corporate restructuring. But his eyes betrayed him. They were gleaming with a cruel sort of satisfaction. I remained perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely behind my back. My military training, all 22 years of it, had taught me to control my response in the face of hostility, to think before acting, to let the enemy reveal their entire strategy before making my own move. Preston seemed to take my silence as a sign of weakness, of defeat. His smile widened. "Security will escort you out, Elias," he said, the words sharp and final. He finally dropped the corporate jargon and let the raw insult shine through. I let a long moment of silence hang in the air between us, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I could feel the worried energy of my team through the thick glass. I knew what they were thinking. They were wondering if I would yell, if I would argue, if I would plead for the job that I had helped define. I did none of those things. I simply met his gaze and asked a very quiet, very precise question. "You're doing this 48 hours before my annual performance bonus is scheduled to be paid out, Preston." He actually chuckled, a short, arrogant sound. "Exactly," he said, clearly proud of his own cleverness. "And Aegis Dynamics just saved a clean $95,000. It's a smart business move, fiscally responsible." I almost felt a flicker of pity for his profound ignorance. He saw a number on a spreadsheet. He didn't see the 17 years of late nights, the canceled family vacations, the sheer mental exhaustion of creating something from nothing. "That bonus," I said, my voice still low and even, "is for the successful deployment of the Aegis Core upgrade. The code that I personally architected, the state-of-the-art encryption that is currently protecting every single national defense asset this country has deployed in the last decade." He waved a dismissive hand as if I were talking about ancient history. "That's all in the past, Elias. That code is the property of Aegis Dynamics now, my father's company, and soon it will be mine. We need fresh blood to take us into the future, not relics from the Cold War clinging to old ways." Relic. The word was designed to sting, to diminish a lifetime of service into a single dismissive label, a dinosaur waiting for extinction. I glanced through the glass and saw it on the faces of my team. I saw the flash of anger in the eyes of my young protege, a brilliant engineer I had personally mentored. I saw the slow, disgusted shake of the head from my oldest colleague, a man who had been with me from the very beginning. They knew my value, and they knew this was not a business decision. This was a personal execution driven by the petty insecurities of a boy who had been handed a kingdom he had never learned how to rule. He thought he was cutting away dead weight. He had no idea he was about to cut the very heart out of his own company. Preston straightened up from the table, his performance complete. He gestured to the door. "You have 10 minutes to clear your desk," he said, his tone final. I gave him a single slow nod. He thought he had won. He thought this was the end of the story. In his mind, he was playing checkers and he had just taken my king. He was about to learn that we weren't playing the same game at all. With a flick of his wrist, Preston motioned to the 2 security guards who had been standing impassively by the main door of the engineering department. They were large men dressed in crisp black uniforms, their faces unreadable. They moved with a quiet efficiency that was somehow more unnerving than open aggression. One stood by my side, the other just behind me. They didn't touch me, but their presence was a cage, a clear and public declaration that I was now considered a threat. A criminal. I took a deep, steadying breath and began the long walk from the conference room back to my desk. The desk that had been my second home for 17 years. Every head in the open plan office was down. Keyboards that had been clattering moments before were now silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the servers in the climate-controlled room and the quiet tread of our shoes on the industrial carpet. It was a walk of shame designed to break my spirit, to make an example out of me for anyone else who dared to question the new king. My desk was in the corner, a space I had earned through years of dedication. It was organized, methodical, just like the code I wrote. Under the watchful eyes of my two shadows, I began to pack my life into a small cardboard box. Each item I touched was a ghost of a memory, a piece of the man they were trying to erase. First, the picture of my daughter Simone. She was smiling, radiant in her cap and gown on the day she graduated from Howard University with the highest honors. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, were full of pride and endless possibility. I picked up the silver frame, my thumb brushing against the glass. This was why I did it. For her. To give her the future she deserved, a future built on a foundation of hard work and integrity. Preston could take my job, but he could never touch the real reason I fought so hard. Next, my gaze fell upon the small framed shadow box on the wall of my cubicle. Inside was the bronze star I had earned during a mission I was still not authorized to speak about. I remembered the heat, the fear, the absolute certainty that I might not see another sunrise. I remembered the faces of the young soldiers I had served with, men who had trusted me with their lives. I had faced down armed enemies in the dead of night, my heart pounding against my ribs, and I had survived. This right here, this was not a battle. This was a tantrum. This was the pathetic power play of an insecure boy who had been given a title instead of earning it. The absurdity of it all was so profound it was almost comical. He thought this was a show of strength, but all he was showing was his own crippling weakness. My honor was not something that could be taken away by a spoiled child in an expensive suit. Finally, my hand rested on a worn, leather-bound notebook. It was filled with 17 years of my thoughts, my theories, my failures, and my breakthroughs. It contained the original algorithms for the Aegis Core scribbled in the middle of the night on pages stained with coffee and sheer determination. This little book was the soul of the company. It was worth more than the entire floor of this building, more than Preston's MBA, more than his trust fund. And he was letting me walk out the door with it, completely oblivious to its true value. I placed the notebook gently into the box on top of Simone's picture. As I turned to leave, my eyes swept across the office one last time. John, an engineer I had mentored for a decade, suddenly found the pattern on the floor intensely fascinating. Maria, who ran our quality assurance team, met my gaze for a fraction of a second, her eyes filled with a silent apology, a look of helpless frustration. They were good people trapped in a bad situation. As the guards led me toward the gleaming front doors, I could feel Preston's eyes on my back from his office. I did not look back. I walked with my head held high, the cardboard box in my arms. This was not an ending. It was an ignition. Just 24 hours earlier, I was in a place that felt more like home than my own office. A SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility buried deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon. There are no windows in a room like that. The walls are reinforced, soundproof, and shielded against any form of electronic eavesdropping. The air is always cool and still carrying the weight of the secrets it protects. Across a polished steel table sat 4 men who held the security of the nation in their hands. General Matthews, a man I had known for over a decade, sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of disciplined focus. Flanking him were 3 full bird colonels, each a leading expert in their respective fields of cyber warfare, naval intelligence, and satellite communications. The atmosphere was one of mutual respect, built on years of trust and proven results. I was in my element. The key innovation in the Aegis Core version 3.0, I explained, gesturing towards a complex diagram on the large monitor, is the implementation of a quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithm. We are essentially future-proofing our communications against the next generation of computational threats. It's not just an upgrade, General, it's a generational leap. Colonel Davies, the cyber warfare expert, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Elias, he began, his voice sharp and precise, Your white paper mentions a dynamic key exchange protocol that adapts in real time to network latency. Can you elaborate on the fail-safe mechanism? What happens if the primary exchange node is compromised during a high-threat scenario, say a carrier strike group operating under complete emissions control? It was a brilliant question, one that cut directly to the heart of the system's resilience. I felt a surge of professional pride. This was a conversation among peers, a high-stakes chess match where every move mattered. An excellent question, Colonel, I responded, switching the display to a detailed flowchart. If the primary node fails to handshake within a predefined window of 300 milliseconds, a decentralized authentication cascade is triggered. Each subordinate asset in the network independently verifies the credentials of its immediate neighbors, creating a redundant web of trust. In short, there is no single point of failure. Even if you cut the head off the snake, the body will continue to function independently until a new command node can be securely established. General Matthews allowed himself a rare, thin smile. "It thinks for itself," he said, more a statement than a question. "Precisely, General," I confirmed. "We've taught it how to survive." It was at that exact moment of triumph, of shared understanding and professional respect, that the secure door to the skiff hissed open. In the rigidly controlled world of the Pentagon, an unscheduled entry into a classified briefing is a cardinal sin. It simply does not happen. Yet, there he was, Preston Hayes III. He strode into the room as if he were walking into a coffee shop, a ridiculously overpriced designer suit hanging awkwardly on his frame. He was holding a tablet and wore a Bluetooth earpiece, a clear violation of the room's strict no electronics policy. The Marine guard at the door looked mortified, clearly having been overruled by Preston flashing his father's credentials. The 4 military officers at the table stiffened their faces, hardening into masks of pure disapproval. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Sorry to interrupt, gentlemen," Preston announced, his voice oozing a false, cheerful confidence that was wildly out of place. "Just wanted to synergize with the team and ensure we're all aligned on the value proposition moving forward." He beamed a wide, clueless smile as if he had just said something profound. I could see General Matthews' jaw clench. Synergy, value proposition. These were the meaningless buzzwords of a business school classroom, utterly alien in a world that dealt with life and death realities. "Excuse me, son," the general said, his voice dangerously low. "Who are you, and what is your clearance level?" Preston's smile faltered for a second. "Preston Hayes III, he said, puffing out his chest. "Executive Vice President of Strategic Innovation at Aegis Dynamics." Colonel Davies, the cyber expert, looked at Preston with undisguised contempt. "Strategic Innovation," he repeated slowly, letting the empty title hang in the air like a bad smell. "I see." I tried to salvage the situation. "Preston is the CEO's son, General. He's new to this side of the business." I had hoped this would excuse his behavior, but it only seemed to make things worse. It confirmed their suspicions that he was nothing more than a product of nepotism. Preston, however, was completely oblivious to the disastrous impression he was making. He walked over to the monitor, tapping it with his finger. "Now I've been looking at the data," he said, "and I think we can really disrupt this space. We need to be more agile, more proactive in our disruptive methodologies. It's all about leveraging our core competencies to create a paradigm shift in the defense sector." It was a waterfall of meaningless jargon, a word salad designed to sound impressive but signifying nothing. Colonel Armstrong, the satellite communications expert who had been silent until now, decided he had heard enough. He leaned back in his chair and fixed Preston with an icy stare. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice cutting through the nonsense. "Let's talk specifics. Your new quantum-resistant algorithm relies on a lattice-based cryptographic structure. Given the current processing limitations of our legacy satellite hardware, how have you mitigated the packet size overhead to ensure that the encrypted data stream can maintain a consistent bit rate without creating a critical bottleneck during tactical data link transmissions? Be specific about the compression ratios and the error correction protocols you've employed." The room fell completely silent. It was a brutally technical, direct question. There was no room for buzzwords, no place to hide. It was a test, and everyone in the room knew it. Preston's face went blank. The confident smile evaporated, replaced by a look of utter panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He stared at the screen, then at the colonel, his eyes wide with incomprehension. He had no idea what the colonel was talking about. He had walked into a gunfight armed with a water pistol and he was just now realizing it. After a silence that stretched for an agonizingly long time, he finally stammered, "Well, that's a very operational detail. Our technical teams like Elias here handle that." He had just thrown me under the bus, but in doing so, he had admitted his own complete and total incompetence in front of his company's most important client. I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm and professional. "What Colonel Armstrong is referring to is the challenge of data density." I began smoothly taking control of the conversation. I then spent the next 5 minutes explaining in precise detail the multi-layered compression system and the adaptive forward error correction we had designed to solve that exact problem. As I spoke, I could feel the tension in the room recede, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of a professional discussion. I had saved the presentation, but the damage was done. Preston Hayes III had not only embarrassed himself, he had embarrassed Aegis Dynamics. He had revealed a fatal flaw in the company's leadership. And in that room where trust is the only currency that matters, he had shown everyone that he was bankrupt. The incident at the Pentagon was a symptom of a much deeper disease. The proof of Preston's dangerous incompetence had been clear a week earlier, not in front of generals, but in the heart of our own engineering department, our sanctuary. We called it the War Room. It was a space with floor-to-ceiling whiteboards always covered in complex equations and lines of code. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the low hum of high-performance computers. This was where we solved the impossible. For days, my team had been wrestling with a critical issue. A data synchronization latency problem had appeared in the Aegis core system during stress tests. Under conditions of heavy electronic jamming like those a naval fleet would face in a real conflict, data packets were being delayed. A delay of a few seconds might not sound like much, but in modern warfare, a few seconds is an eternity. It was a blind spot, a fatal vulnerability that could cost lives. After 3 sleepless nights, we had a breakthrough. I stood before the main whiteboard outlining the solution to my team of 15 brilliant engineers. "The problem is in the core transfer protocol," I explained, my marker squeaking as I drew a diagram. "It's efficient, but it's too rigid. When it's hit with targeted interference, it chokes. The solution is to rebuild it. We'll use our proven, battle-tested architecture as a foundation, but we'll design a new, dynamic routing system that can intelligently reroute data packets around electronic interference. It's not a patch, it's a full system transplant. It will be difficult. It will take 6 weeks of intensive work around the clock. But the result will be a system that is 100% reliable under any conditions." A murmur of agreement went through the room. They were the best in the world. They understood the stakes, and they weren't afraid of hard work. They knew this was the right way, the only way to guarantee the safety of the men and women who depended on our technology. Just as we were about to start assigning tasks, the door to the war room slid open, and Preston Hayes III walked in. He was holding a tablet, and he had the smug look of someone who thought they had discovered fire. He was late as usual, and had clearly not read any of the technical briefs we had sent him. He glanced at my complex diagram on the whiteboard and scoffed. 6 weeks, he said, a dismissive wave of his hand. "That's ancient thinking. We don't have 6 weeks. The market rewards speed." He strode to the front of the room, tapping his tablet. "I was just reading a fascinating article about decentralized mesh networking. It's completely revolutionizing the logistics industry. No central hub, every node talks to every other node. It's fast. It's agile. It's disruptive." David Chen, one of our most senior engineers, and a man with a PhD from MIT, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir," he began, choosing his words carefully, "a decentralized mesh network is an interesting concept, but the processing overhead on our existing hardware would be significant. It's not truly designed for the kind of secure, real-time tactical applications we build. The risk of data collision and packet loss would be..." Preston cut him off. "Risk," he snapped. "The only risk is being left behind by our competitors." "I don't pay you people," he said, scanning the room with a condescending glare, "to tell me what is not possible. I pay you to innovate. I don't want to hear about the old, slow, safe ways of doing things. I need disruption." The room fell silent. The word hung in the air, a foreign and unwelcome sound. In our world, disruption was a bad thing. Disruption meant a signal was lost. Disruption meant a soldier was left vulnerable. I stepped forward, placing myself between Preston and my team. I kept my voice level, devoid of the anger that was churning in my gut. "Preston," I said calmly, This isn't a Silicon Valley startup. We are not developing a social media app where it's okay to move fast and break things. We are building the systems that protect American lives. In our field, stability is infinitely more important than disruption. A single point of failure, a bug in the code, doesn't just result in a bad quarterly report. It can mean a missile doesn't launch. It can mean a submarine is detected. It can mean a squadron of pilots flies into an ambush. A small bug can cost soldiers their lives. We do not have that luxury. My words were meant to be a dose of reality, a reminder of the gravity of our work. But Preston didn't hear the logic. He only heard a challenge to his authority. His face flushed with anger. "That's the kind of fear-based thinking that's holding this company back," he retorted. "My father may have been content with slow and steady, but I am not. This is not a debate. It is a directive. My father put me in charge of innovation, and this is what innovation looks like." He pointed a finger at the team. "I want a working prototype of the decentralized mesh network solution on my desk by the end of the month. Understood." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the war room, leaving a trail of stunned silence and resentment in his wake. The team looked at me, their faces a mixture of frustration and disbelief. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then I turned back to the whiteboard, to the elegant, reliable, and safe solution that we had all agreed upon. The solution that would take 6 weeks of hard work but would guarantee the safety of our soldiers. With a heavy heart, I picked up the eraser. As my team watched in silence, I wiped away the diagram, leaving nothing but a blank white space. In that moment, we all understood. Preston wasn't just a fool. He was a clear and present danger to the company and to the mission we had all sworn to uphold. The foolishness I had just witnessed in the war room was not a surprise. It was a prophecy fulfilled. And the man who had foreseen it all was General Wallace Thornton. The memory came to me as clear as if it were yesterday, a flashback not just of a day, but of an era. It was 10 years ago. I was in my early 40s, and Aegis Dynamics was still a place that felt like a family, a unit bound by a shared mission. I was sitting in the general's office. It was a room that felt like a museum of a life well lived. The walls were paneled with dark, rich cherry wood and lined with bookshelves groaning under the weight of history and military strategy. There were no motivational posters with empty slogans. Instead, there were framed maps of old battlefields and a single powerful photograph of the general as a young lieutenant in Vietnam, his eyes old even then. The air smelled faintly of old leather and the pipe tobacco he used to smoke before his wife made him quit. He was in his late 70s at the time, his body starting to fail him, but his mind as sharp as a bayonet. He had personally recruited me from the Navy, seeing something in my work that I had not yet seen in myself. He was more than a boss. He was my mentor. He pushed a document across his large oak desk towards me. It was my new employment contract. "A few updates, Elias," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, mostly standard legal boilerplate. "But I want you to pay close attention to Section 11, subsection B." I picked up the papers, my brow furrowing as I read the clause. It was unusual, to say the least. It was written in dense legal language, but the meaning was clear. It detailed a specific scenario and unprovoked termination within 72 hours of a performance bonus payout. And it outlined a consequence so extreme, so absolute, that I thought it must be a mistake. The complete and legal transfer of the intellectual property rights of the Aegis core system to me personally. I looked up at him, confused. "General," I began, "I don't understand." "This is very generous, but why is it necessary? Is there something I should be worried about?" He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. He looked out the window for a moment, his gaze distant as if he were seeing a future I could not. "Elias," he said finally, turning his piercing eyes back to me, "I built this company on a simple principle, honor. We do the right thing, we protect our people, and we deliver the best damn product to the men and women who are defending this country. That's it. That's the foundation." He paused, tapping a thick finger on the desk for emphasis. "But the world is changing. I am an old man. I will not be here forever. And there will be those who come after me who do not understand that foundation. They will see this place not as a mission, but as a machine for making money. They will value profit margins over people, and they will see your genius not as an asset to be nurtured, but as a resource to be squeezed." He was speaking with a heavy heart, the burden of a leader who knew he could not protect his legacy forever. "This clause," he continued, pointing at the paper in my hands, "is not a gift. It is a safety net. It is a fail-safe, a dead man's switch. It ensures that what you have poured your sweat and your intellect into the very soul of this company will never fall into the hands of a fool. It ensures that my life's work cannot be dismantled by arrogance or greed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper filled with a raw intensity. "This company, Elias, is not the name on the door. It's not the buildings or the stock price. It's you. That code is you. Your brain is the most valuable asset Aegis Dynamics will ever have. This clause protects you, and in doing so, it protects this company from itself." He finished with the words that I would never forget, the words that defined his entire philosophy of life. "A good leader protects his people," he said, his voice firm and clear even after he is gone. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of his trust and his foresight settling upon me. I finally understood. This was not a legal document. It was a last will and testament. It was a final strategic command from a brilliant general who saw the battlefield of the future with perfect clarity. It was his last act of loyalty to me and to the country he had served his entire life. I looked down at the contract and then back at the old warrior sitting across from me. "I understand, General," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I signed the document without another moment of hesitation. It was a pact, a promise sealed in that quiet office, a trap that would lie dormant for a decade, waiting for the right kind of fool to walk into it. The front door of my house closed behind me with a heavy, final click, shutting out the world. The silence inside was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm raging within my own mind. I walked through the familiar rooms of my home, a place that my late wife and I had filled with love and memories. But tonight it felt hollow, like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. I ended up where I always did when I needed to think, in my study. It was my sanctuary, a room lined wall to wall with the history of human conflict and the beautiful logic of cryptography. Books on the Napoleonic Wars stood next to texts on quantum mechanics. A detailed model of the submarine I served on the USS Toledo sat on a shelf next to a picture of my wife. This room was a map of my mind, a place of order and reason, but tonight that order felt like a mockery. My world was in chaos. I sat down in my worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint scent of my wife's perfume, and stared at the piece of paper on my desk. It was an invoice from Georgetown University Law School. The first tuition payment for my daughter Simone was due in less a month. It was a formidable number, an amount that represented years of careful saving and planning. Before today, that number had been a symbol of pride, of a promise fulfilled. I had promised my wife before she passed that I would give our daughter the best education possible, that I would set her up for a life of success and independence. Now that number on the page felt like a judgment, a testament to my failure. The face of Preston Hayes III, so smug and arrogant, swam before my eyes. I felt a surge of cold anger followed by a wave of crushing self-doubt. Had I been a fool? Should I have fought back, yelled, argued, defended myself in that glass room? Or was my silence the only dignified response? I had spent my entire life in worlds governed by honor and a clear chain of command. I was not built for the petty politics of the corporate world, a world where a boy with a fancy degree could discard a man's entire life's work with a casual wave of his hand. My thoughts were a downward spiral, pulling me into a dark place of regret and uncertainty. And then a lifeline. My laptop on the desk chimed with a familiar, cheerful tone. A video call. It was Simone. My heart both leaped and sank. I wanted to hear her voice more than anything, but I didn't want her to hear the defeat in mine. I took a deep breath, forced a smile onto my face that felt like a mask, and accepted the call. Her face filled the screen, bright and full of life, her dorm room visible behind her, cluttered with law books and pictures of her friends. She was the perfect blend of my intelligence and her mother's radiant warmth. "Hey, Dad," she said, her smile genuine and effortless. "Just calling to check in. How was your day?" The simple question felt like a physical blow. "It was a day, sweetheart," I managed to say, my voice sounding strained and unfamiliar to my own ears. "You know how it is. Meetings, deadlines, the usual." I tried to keep my tone light, but I knew I was failing. Simone's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of sharp, intelligent concern. She had always been able to read me better than anyone. "Dad," she said, her voice softer now. "What's wrong? Your voice sounds tired, more than tired. It sounds heavy." I tried to deflect again. "It's nothing, baby girl, just a long day. Don't you worry about me." How are your classes going? Are you getting ready for midterms? She let me talk, her eyes never leaving my face. She listened patiently, and when I was finished, she cut straight through my defenses. No, she said, her voice firm but kind. It's more than that. I know you. I can hear it. Dad, look at me. I met her gaze on the screen. I know when you're lying, she said gently. You don't have to tell me what happened. Not if you don't want to. But you have to know that it doesn't matter. Tears welled up in my eyes and I couldn't stop them. It was the first time I had allowed myself to feel the full weight of the day's humiliation. Listen to me, she continued, her voice filled with a fierce loyalty that shook me to my core. I don't know what happened today, but I know you. I know the man who raised me. Whatever it is, we will face it. Together. You're my hero, Dad. You always have been, and you always will be. We are going to be okay. Her words were a shield, a balm, a declaration of war against the despair that had been consuming me. She wasn't just my daughter. She was my legacy. She was my mission. We talked for a few more minutes, and I found my strength returning with every word she spoke. When the call ended, I was left staring at the blank screen, the silence in the room no longer feeling empty but full of purpose. My self-doubt was gone, burned away by the fire of my daughter's love. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. I looked back at the tuition bill on my desk. It was no longer a symbol of my failure. It was now a symbol of my fight. Preston Hayes III had not just insulted my career. He had threatened my daughter's future. He had threatened the promise I made to my wife. He had made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was fighting a disgruntled employee. He had no idea he had just declared war on a father. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name I was looking for, my lawyer. The trap that General Thornton had set 10 years ago was about to be sprung. The next morning I was not in the Aegis Dynamics boardroom, but in my mind I saw it all unfold with perfect clarity. It was a room designed to project power. A vast polished mahogany table reflected the glittering skyline of the city. High-backed leather chairs were arranged with military precision. At the head of the table sat Arthur Hayes Jr., the CEO, a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored suit. And next to him, basking in the spotlight, was his son, Preston Hayes III. He was in the middle of his victory speech. He stood before the board of directors, a collection of stern, older men who represented the old guard of the company, the generation that had worked with General Thornton. Preston was using his usual empty corporate language, presenting the termination of my 17-year career as a bold, strategic move. It was a decisive action, Preston announced, his voice filled with a self-congratulatory tone. A necessary step to streamline our talent pipeline and inject a new, more dynamic culture into the engineering department. By trimming legacy overhead, he continued, and I knew he meant me, we have sent a clear message that Aegis Dynamics is looking to the future. This single move has already resulted in a significant cost saving for the upcoming quarter. He clicked a button on his remote and a slide appeared on the large screen behind him showing a graph with a tiny, almost insignificant dip in projected expenses. He presented this $95,000 saving as if he had just conquered a new continent. His father Arthur watched him with a complex expression, a mixture of paternal pride and a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of unease. The board members looked mostly bored, having seen and heard this kind of empty posturing from young executives for decades. It was in that precise moment of manufactured triumph that the heavy soundproof doors to the boardroom opened without a sound. A man stepped inside. He was in his late 60s, dressed in a perfectly tailored, conservative gray suit. He had a full head of silver hair and a calm, composed demeanor that radiated an authority far more real than Preston's noisy confidence. This was Julian Croft, one of the most respected corporate lawyers in the city. He had also been General Wallace Thornton's personal attorney and closest friend for over 40 years. Arthur Hayes Jr. looked up, his annoyance at the interruption clear. "Julian," he said, his voice sharp, "what is the meaning of this? We are in the middle of a board meeting." Julian closed the door gently behind him and walked slowly towards the table. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who knows he is in complete control of the situation. "I apologize for the intrusion," Arthur Julian said, his voice calm and even. "But I am here this morning on behalf of my client, Mr. Elias Vance, and I have reason to believe that the matter I need to discuss is directly relevant to the cost-saving initiative you are currently celebrating." Preston scoffed from the front of the room, a smirk on his face. Elias Vance is no longer an employee of this company, he declared. He has no business here, and neither do you. Security. Julian raised a single placid hand, and the two security guards who had started to move from the back of the room immediately stopped, unsure of what to do. On the contrary, Mr. Hayes, Julian said, his eyes locking onto Preston's. Your actions yesterday have in fact made Mr. Vance the single most important individual to the future of this company. A confused murmur rippled through the board members. Julian reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single thin file folder. He placed it gently on the polished table. As you all know, he began, his voice taking on the tone of a history professor. General Thornton was a man of great foresight. He believed in planning for every contingency, a discipline he learned on the battlefield. Preston was becoming visibly agitated. Get to the point, Croft. What is this nonsense? Julian opened the folder, revealing a copy of my employment contract. I would like to draw the board's attention, he said, his voice projecting to every corner of the room, to Section 11, Subsection B of Mr. Vance's contract. It is a unique clause, one drafted by General Thornton himself, a clause he affectionately referred to as his fail-safe. Julian put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read the clause aloud, his voice slow and deliberate, each word landing with the force of a hammer blow. Should the employment of Elias Vance be terminated by Aegis Dynamics without cause, he began, and should said termination occur within the 72-hour period immediately preceding the scheduled payment of a duly earned performance bonus, then the full and uncontestable ownership of all intellectual property designated as Project Aegis Core, including all associated algorithms, source codes, and patents, shall be legally and irrevocably transferred from Aegis Dynamics to the sole ownership of Elias Vance. The silence in the room was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of it. The board members, once bored, were now leaning forward, their faces etched with alarm. One of them discreetly slid his phone under the table, no doubt messaging his stockbroker. I could picture the camera of my mind panning across their faces, but it was the two Hayes men I focused on. Arthur Hayes Jr.'s face had gone from confusion to a ghastly pale white. The slight unease he had felt earlier had transformed into pure cold horror. He understood. He looked at his son, truly looked at him perhaps for the first time, and saw not a brilliant heir but the architect of their ruin. But Preston's reaction was the most dramatic. His journey from triumph to terror happened in less than 30 seconds. First smug amusement, then, as Julian read, a flicker of confusion, then outright disbelief. That's ridiculous, he stammered, looking at his father for support. That's not legally possible. It's a joke, right? Julian looked up from the paper, his gaze unwavering. I can assure you it is 100% legal and ironclad. General Thornton made sure of that. The contract is a masterpiece of legal protection. Preston's face began to crumble. But the Aegis Core, he whispered the words barely audible. That's the whole company. It's valued at... Julian finished the sentence for him, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The most recent independent valuation placed the intellectual property at approximately $75 million, though I suspect that figure is now conservative. The final shred of Preston's composure vanished. Panic took over. His breathing became shallow and rapid. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape that did not exist. Julian Croft slowly closed the folder and placed his hands on the table. He looked directly at Preston, his voice calm, clear, and utterly devastating. So to be perfectly clear for the board and for the minutes of this meeting, yesterday afternoon, in a misguided attempt to deny Mr. Vance his $95,000 bonus, you, Mr. Hayes, legally and irrevocably transferred the ownership of this company's core $75 million asset directly to him. Julian paused, letting the full weight of the catastrophe settle in the silent room. Then he delivered the final fatal blow. On behalf of my client, I thank you for your generosity. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the tomb, like silence. Julian Croft was gone. For a long, stretched-out moment, no one moved. The 10 members of the board sat like stone statues, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Preston remained at the front of the room, frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, as if the lawyer's final words had turned him to salt. But it was his father, Arthur Hayes II, who finally broke the spell. He made a small, choking sound in the back of his throat. He slowly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor with a sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. He rose to his feet, but he did not look like the powerful CEO of Aegis Dynamics anymore. He looked like a frail old man. His hands were trembling. The healthy, confident color had drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. He turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes fixing on his son. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a roar of anger, but a dry, rasping whisper filled with a terrible, trembling disbelief. "Preston," he whispered, "what have you done?" Preston flinched as if he had been struck. He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. "Me," he stammered, his voice cracking. "This wasn't me. This is a setup. It's Vance. He tricked us. He planned this all along. And where was the legal department? Why did nobody warn me about this insane clause?" He was flailing desperately, trying to throw blame in every direction to deflect the crushing weight of responsibility that was about to land on his shoulders. But the men in the room were not fools. John Carmichael, the oldest member of the board, and a man who had been General Thornton's first business partner, spoke up, his voice like gravel. "The legal department was not consulted on your decision, Preston," he said coldly. "The record shows it was a unilateral action. And are you suggesting that General Thornton, the founder of this company, was incompetent for putting that clause in the contract? He put it there to protect our most valuable asset. He just never imagined the threat would come from inside his own office." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Arthur's trembling grew more violent, and the whisper in his voice was gone, replaced by the first tremors of a volcanic rage. "You fool," he hissed at his son. "You arrogant, entitled little fool. I gave you everything. The best schools, a position you never earned my trust." He took a staggering step forward, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "And what do you do with it? You throw it all away. Do you have any idea what you have just done?" The rage finally broke through. He lunged forward, stopping just short of the table, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You did not save $95,000. He roared, his voice bouncing off the glass walls. "You gave away $75 million. You gave away our future, our legacy, everything." Preston stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not my fault," he shrieked, his voice shrill and childish. "I was trying to be innovative. I was trying to make the company stronger. It's not fair." It was at that moment that Catherine Reed, the chief financial officer, finally spoke. She was a calm, no-nonsense woman who dealt in numbers, not emotions. She looked at neither Arthur nor Preston. She simply looked at the screen at the end of the room and pressed a button on her tablet. The slide of Preston's pathetic cost-saving graph vanished, replaced by a stark, brutal financial analysis. It was a single slide with two columns: company valuation before 11B activation and company valuation after 11B activation. The number on the right was a tiny fraction of the number on the left. "The board deserves to see the reality of the situation," Catherine said, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Without the intellectual property of the Aegis core, Aegis Dynamics is no longer a defense technology company. Our primary asset is gone. We are now, for all intents and purposes, a minor government consulting firm with a handful of service contracts that will likely not be renewed. Our projected revenue for the next fiscal year," she paused, "letting the silence build, has dropped by 87%. Another board member let out an audible gasp. Catherine continued, her voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Our stock will be worthless by the time the market opens tomorrow. Our lines of credit will be frozen. We will be unable to make payroll next month. The numbers are clear. The company is insolvent. We will have to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the end of the week." The stark, undeniable reality of the numbers did what Arthur's yelling could not. It broke Preston completely. The fight went out of him, replaced by a wave of pure, undiluted horror. He finally understood. He looked at the screen, at the catastrophic numbers that represented his failure, and a low moan escaped his lips. The strength seemed to drain from his body. He staggered backward and collapsed into one of the expensive leather chairs, his head falling into his hands. "No," he sobbed, the sound muffled by his palms. "No, no, no, no." The arrogant executive was gone. All that was left was a terrified boy who had broken his father's most expensive toy and had just realized it could never be fixed. Arthur Hayes II watched his son's complete and utter collapse, but there was no pity in his eyes. There was only a vast, empty wasteland of grief and a final terrible surge of rage. He had not just lost his company. He had lost the illusion of the son he thought he had. He had lost his entire life's work, the legacy he had inherited from General Thornton, all of it sacrificed on the altar of his own son's ego. He slowly walked around the table until he stood directly in front of his weeping son. He looked down at him, his face a ruin. "My father, your grandfather, started this company with nothing but his honor and his mind," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet now. "He built an empire. I spent 30 years of my life trying to live up to his legacy, to build upon it, to make it stronger so that one day I could pass it on to you." He let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You destroyed it all in a single afternoon because you were too arrogant to listen and too stupid to understand what you had." He raised a trembling hand and pointed a finger at the door. And then he passed his final judgment, the words of a father disowning his own creation. "Get out of here!" he screamed, his voice finally breaking with the full force of his pain and fury. "Get out of my sight! You are no longer my son." The collapse was not a slow decline. It was a demolition. A controlled and yet utterly chaotic implosion that began the moment Julian Croft walked out of that boardroom. I watched it all from a distance, not with a sense of triumph, but with the grim satisfaction of a man watching a force of nature run its inevitable course. The first shockwave was financial. The next morning, every major news network was leading with the story. I saw it on a television in a small coffee shop, the sound muted but the images speaking volumes. A grim-faced news anchor stood before a backdrop of plunging red arrows and the Aegis Dynamics logo. The headline at the bottom of the screen was brutal and direct: "Aegis Dynamics in freefall after loss of core technology." The Chiron continued: "Stock plummets an unprecedented 87% in pre-market trading, wiping out over $100 million in market capitalization in a matter of hours." The stunning collapse comes after reports of a catastrophic management decision by the CEO's son, Preston Hayes III. They showed a picture of Preston, a professionally shot headshot where he looked confident and visionary. It was now the face of corporate incompetence, a symbol of how quickly an empire could be turned to dust by arrogance. The second shockwave was human. While the stock market was reacting to the numbers, the real value of the company was walking out the front door. The atmosphere inside the Aegis Dynamics headquarters, I was later told, was like a wake. The usual bustling energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. At precisely 9 a.m., David Chen, my most senior and respected engineer, walked out of his office carrying a small cardboard box. He placed his company ID and his resignation letter on his empty desk, gave a single sad look around the office, and walked out without a word. His departure was the signal. It was the crack in the dam. Within the hour, Maria from Quality Assurance followed. Then the entire cybersecurity team. A line formed outside the Human Resources office, a quiet, orderly procession of the brightest minds in the industry, all turning their backs on a company that had betrayed its own soul. They were not just leaving a job, they were making a statement. Their loyalty had never been to a brand or a CEO. It had been to the mission and to the man who had led them, me. Without its core technology and without its core people, Aegis Dynamics was now just an empty building full of expensive furniture. A hollow shell. The final public shockwave came at the end of the week. Arthur Hayes II called a press conference. He stood at a podium flanked by the company's lawyers, the harsh glare of the television lights illuminating a man who had aged a decade in just a few days. He looked frail, defeated a king presiding over the ruins of his kingdom. He read from a prepared statement, his voice a monotone devoid of its usual power. He announced that to avoid total liquidation, the board had accepted a buyout offer. The name of the buyer was the ultimate humiliation. Orion Strategic Solutions, our biggest and most aggressive competitor. He spoke of the sale in sterile business terms, but everyone understood the reality. It was not a merger, it was a surrender. Aegis Dynamics, a titan of the industry, had been sold for pennies on the dollar, its remaining assets to be stripped and absorbed by its rival. And then came the final announcement. "Effective immediately," Arthur said, his voice finally cracking with emotion, "I will be resigning as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board. I offer my deepest apologies to our shareholders and employees for this catastrophic failure of leadership. The room erupted in a chaotic volley of shouted questions and flashing cameras, a frantic, merciless end to a long and once distinguished career. But the true story of the ruin was not in the news reports or the press conferences. It was in a quiet, darkened apartment. Preston Hayes III sat alone, surrounded by the trappings of a life he no longer had. An expensive but sterile condo with a view of a city that had now turned its back on him. The suit he had worn on the day of his triumph was now rumpled and stained, and a 3-day-old beard shadowed his pale, drawn face. He was staring at his phone, his thumb frantically scrolling through his contacts, a desperate search for a lifeline. He called a friend from Stanford who was now a partner at a powerful venture capital firm. The call went straight to voicemail. He tried again, a family friend who sat on the board of 3 major corporations. The phone rang twice, then the call was disconnected. He was being shut out, excommunicated from the world that had once worshipped him. His network, his privilege, his entire identity had evaporated overnight. He was a ghost. With a trembling finger, he scrolled to his father's name. He pressed the call button. He did not even hear a ring. A cold, automated voice simply said, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." His own father had erased him. The finality of it, the absolute and total rejection, was a blow from which he would never recover. Preston let the phone slip from his numb fingers. It clattered onto the floor, the screen dark. He sat there in the encroaching darkness of his empty apartment, a man who had everything and was now left with nothing. He was utterly and completely alone. 6 months later, the world was a different place. Or perhaps it was the same world, but I was finally in my rightful place in it. I stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window looking out at the panoramic view of Washington, D.C. The distant white spire of the Washington Monument pierced a clear blue sky. This was my new office. The headquarters of Orion Strategic Solutions had bought out the shell of Aegis Dynamics, but they had given me and my team our own semi-autonomous division. They gave us a blank check, a clear mission, and the one thing I had been missing for years: trust. The space was the complete opposite of my old office. It was open, filled with natural light and humming with the vibrant energy of creation. Whiteboards covered in the elegant mathematics of our new project lined the walls. There was a low murmur of excited conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the sound of brilliant minds doing what they loved, unburdened by fear or incompetence. I turned back to the room where my team was gathered around a holographic display. My entire core team of 15 engineers had resigned from Aegis Dynamics the day after I was fired, and every single one of them was here with me now. David Chen was at the display, passionately debating a point about neural network integration with Maria, who was challenging him with a sharp, insightful question. They looked happy, energized, and respected. They were not just employees, they were partners. We were working on our new project, a system we had codenamed Project Sentinel. It was a predictive threat analysis platform, an AI-powered system that was light years beyond the reactive defenses of the Aegis core. Aegis was a shield. Sentinel was a watchtower capable of seeing threats before they even materialized. It was the most ambitious and important work of my life. The problem David was saying is that the predictive model is generating too many false positives when simulating a multi-vector cyber assault. Maria countered immediately. That's because we're treating each vector as an independent threat. But they aren't. They're coordinated. We need to teach the AI to recognize the ghost in the machine, the signature of a single human adversary behind the attack, not just the attack itself. I smiled. This was the music of true innovation. This was the synergy that Preston Hayes III had always talked about but had never understood. It wasn't something you could force with buzzwords. It grew organically out of mutual respect and a shared passion for solving impossible problems. I walked over to the display. "Maria is right," I said, and the team fell silent, turning their attention to me. "We're thinking like engineers. We need to think like spies. Let's build a new learning model based on historical espionage tactics. Let's teach it to recognize deception." A wave of excitement went through the room as they grasped the new concept. It was in that exact moment of collective breakthrough that a quiet notification popped up on the corner of my laptop screen. It was an email. The subject line was short and to the point: Project Sentinel approval. It was from General Matthews at the Pentagon. My heart began to beat a little faster. I held up a hand. One moment, everyone I said, my voice steady. I walked over to my computer and opened the email. The words on the screen seemed to glow. "Elias, It read, "I just left the final review board meeting. They were speechless. Congratulations. The board has unanimously approved Project Sentinel for full-scale development and deployment. The initial contract is for $150 million over 5 years. Welcome back to the fight, my friend. The country needs you." For a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Then I turned to my team, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. "Well, team," I said, "it's official." A split second of silence was followed by an eruption of cheers and applause. David Chen let out a whoop of joy. Maria hugged the person next to her. There were high fives and triumphant laughter. This was our victory, a shared validation of all our hard work, all our sacrifice, and all the risk we had taken together. It was a perfect moment, a pure and unadulterated taste of success. And in the middle of that perfect, joyful noise, my personal phone sitting on the desk buzzed with a text message. I glanced down at the screen. The name on it was Preston Hayes III. My celebration stopped for a half second as I read the preview of the message. It was just a few pathetic, desperate words. "You've ruined everything for me. Please." I looked at the message, at this ghost from a past life, this sad little plea from the boy who had tried to break me. And I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. Just a profound and complete absence of feeling. He had become irrelevant. He was a footnote in a chapter of my life that was already over. While my team was still celebrating around me, I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to read the rest of his excuses or his pleas. I simply swiped left and pressed the delete button. The message vanished, erased as completely as he had once tried to erase me. I put the phone back down, face down, and turned my full attention back to my team, to my family. The genuine smile returned to my face, brighter and more confident than before. I walked back to the window and looked out at the city, at the monuments built to honor service and sacrifice. The past was gone. The future was here, and for the first time in a very long time, the horizon looked limitless. In the corporate world, loyalty is often treated as a liability and experience as a relic of the past. But true value built on integrity and expertise is an asset that can never be fired. It simply finds a new, more deserving home where it can truly thrive.